Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. And continuing our discussion about parables in the Gospels, we need to make the point that parables are not allegories. They are different. An allegory is a story in which each individual element in the story refers to something completely foreign and completely different than what that story appears to be talking about. A parable is not. Remember, a parable is just a simple earthly illustration, a physical illustration to demonstrate a spiritual truth and to make a spiritual point. And the best way to really demonstrate this difference is to show you from Luke 10. Notice Luke chapter 10. This is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And Jesus was in a conversation with a lawyer, and the lawyer wanted to justify himself. In Luke 10 and verse 29, it says, wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" So the lawyer understood that the law of Moses said to love your neighbor, but the problem is the lawyer thought there were some people who just didn't qualify as his neighbor, that he really didn't have to love, he really didn't have to care for. And so Jesus tells him a parable to totally transform his thinking about who his neighbor really is, and to tell him that he needs to be a neighbor to everybody by showing them love. And he demonstrates that with this parable. Notice Luke 10 verse 30. Jesus said to him, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return I will repay you.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands?" And he said, "The one who showed mercy toward him." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." Now there's a lot that can be said about this parable, but the basic point here is that he's trying to show this lawyer, you go be the neighbor. You go love your neighbor. Don't try to define who your neighbor is based on ethnicity or what group they belong to or what economic status they are. You just love your neighbor, and anybody that you have opportunity to feel compassion on and love and show kindness to, that's who your neighbor is. Well, if we treat this like an allegory, I'll show you what that looks like, because St. Augustine in the 4th century AD actually treated this like an allegory. And so what he did was he took every individual element of this parable and believed it to be referring to something completely foreign, completely different to what it appears that this is talking about. So for instance, in verse 30, he says that Jerusalem is the heavenly state that Adam fell from, his sinless state, and Jericho is his mortality, because he lost his immortality because of sin. And those robbers, well, that's Satan and his demons. And when it says they stripped him and they beat him, it meant they stripped him of his immortality, and they beat him by persuading him to sin, and they left him half dead because he was spiritually dead after he sinned. And he does that. He goes through every verse and just assigns meaning to things like the oil and the wine and the beast. And he says that the inn is the church and that the innkeeper is Paul the Apostle. And when he does that, he misses the entire point of the parable. That is not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is not intending to give some doctrinal treatise on the fall of man or some prophetic note about what will happen with Paul the Apostle. That has nothing to do with what Jesus is saying. He's laying down a simple physical story to make a simple spiritual truth about loving one's neighbor. And when we treat parables like that, like allegories, we totally lose the original meaning and we totally misinterpret Jesus Christ. And let me give you one more classic example as we close, because this is one you'll run across today in Matthew 24. Matthew chapter 24, this is a parable of the faithful slave. And basically, Jesus' point in Matthew 24, verses 45 through 51, is that we don't know when our master is going to return, but we have been put in charge of, keeping the master's household intact and feeding his servants and all that. And so we need to handle our responsibility here on earth so that when our master returns, when Jesus comes back, we'll be ready to meet him. He'll be able to commend us for respecting him. Well, here's what the Jehovah's Witnesses do. They treat this as an allegory, and they say in verse 45, the faithful and sensible slave that his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time. Jehovah's Witnesses claim that that faithful slave is the Watchtower Society. And what it means is that the Watchtower Society gives God's slaves their food, their spiritual food, by sending them articles and written materials and all that. But folks, you see, that's just nonsense. That has nothing to do with this parable. That's treating this as an allegory, taking something that this parable has nothing to do with and giving it meaning. We cannot do that. We must never do that. I hope that that is clear and helpful, and Lord willing, I'll see you next time.